Let us start. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to this briefing, which, as you know, is supported by Wilderness Foundation Africa and ICCF. Thank you, as always, for your time. I know time is scarce when you're a member of Parliament, so thank you very much. Also, just to say that I did make contact with the new chairperson, and we had an engagement about this. She started her study leave today, so hopefully she'll be able to join us with the next briefing. So as discussed last week, today we will try to get a better understanding about these concepts of one health and one welfare, which still sometimes confuses me a little bit as well. And we have two excellent speakers who's going to help us with that. Dr. Kelly Marnovic, who is in the Kruger at the moment, but is going to speak to us about one welfare, and Professor Wanda Makoter, who is going to speak to us on One Health. So I'm first going to welcome Professor Wanda Makoter, who is the director of the Center for Viral Zoonosis at the University of Pretoria. She occupies two research chairs, one on infectious diseases of animals, and then also a chair in people, health and places at the Future Africa Institute, which is what you're seeing there behind her. In 2021, she was, I think, as the only South African appointed and also appointed as co-chair of the One Health High-Level Expert Panel, or as it's known now in the UN world of acronyms, OLEP, which advises the WHO, OIE, FAO, and UNEP, and also play an important role in several South African governmental committees. So Professor Makoter is going to speak to us, as I said, about the idea of One Health, and also giving us a bit of an idea what they are doing in OLEP, which I'm sure will be very interesting. And then after that, I will introduce Kelly Marnovic, who will then speak to us about One Welfare. And then we'll have questions and answers as usual. So Prof, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction and for having me as a speaker today. Will I be able to share my screen? I should. It's just...
And can I just say, while we're doing that, I will forward this presentation to all the MPs as well. I know you always would like that, and I'll send it as soon as we're finished with the meeting.
Can you see my screen? And is it in full presentation view?
It is. It's perfect. Thank you.
I never know with these platforms, but every day is a surprise sometimes. So thank you. I'm going to spend a short amount of time just sharing some information, and then we can have some discussion around it. So I think you all, with COVID, this whole conversation about the need for a more coordinated, holistic approach, really incorporating everyone, stakeholders, communities, has been a conversation that's been at the forefront again. So it's not really a new conversation that we need to look at One Health again in terms of pandemic prevention, but also in terms of several other health aspects. But it's a conversation that's really necessary. And I think everybody's feeling is that it needs to start becoming practical. And I will share a few of those thoughts as we go along. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of why this is necessary, what it means, and then I will speak a bit about the international OLAF panel and where that fits in. And all of this link, animal welfare is a very important part of everything that I'm going to say, and I'm going to try and highlight that, but Kelly will definitely give more information on those aspects. So I think everybody knows what zoonotic diseases are after COVID, but we're basically dealing with this diversity of pathogens in nature, and that's this first part. And this is not new. These pathogens have always been there. They can occur most of the time in wildlife, so it includes bats, rodents, and wildlife is quite a loaded term, because you can have farmed wildlife, you can have captive wildlife, you can have free-roaming wildlife, and all those things require different ways of managing. So wildlife is not just wildlife anymore, but it can also be in vectors and other animals, and these pathogens don't affect these animals, but then we get spillover to humans, and we sit with a situation where it can either stop there you have 1 or 2 infections, it stays local, or with travel these days, unfortunately, global spread is a reality when these outbreaks happen and it's not contained very quickly. And then it's a pandemic that we're dealing with now. So if we go back to COVID again, so COVID we think is also a zoonotic disease, although there's a lot of question marks. I should have put 100 question marks there because we don't really know where it came from. We know there's similar viruses in bats, but it's not the same as COVID. The wet markets has been implicated, and specifically wildlife sources, but there's no proof. So actually, we really have an idea that it occurs somewhere in wildlife. How it got into the human population is completely unsure. But we do know we deal now with a disease in humans. So even COVID, we need to think about wildlife and the role that it may have played in the original spillover events. And there may have been other animals also involved. So what we also know through the years, and this is actually very general data, if you go and look at geographical specific data for geographical areas, we have very limited data on what lead to these spillover events. So we know it's anthropogenic, which means it's to do with human activity most of the time on several levels. It can be human behavior, it can be land use changes, it can be environmental changes, it can be climate change, but we're not exactly sure how these factors play a role in very specific disease spillover. We're basically extrapolating these general factors from literature and from previous outbreaks, and then we model it for other regions of the world, and we say this is going to lead to spillover. So there's still a lot of unknowns of how these factors play a role, but we do know the reason why there's contact between the animals that have the pathogens and the humans is because of some human activity. And that's an important point going forward in terms of One Health approaches, because we can't just focus on trying to test for pathogens. We need to start focusing on the reasons of why this spillover happened from wildlife to humans. And that's where animal welfare is also very important. So if you look at this diagram, and I've put all the references on here, just a few practical examples. So if you, for instance, look at wildlife distribution and density, as soon as there's some environmental changes, like for instance, you take out a forest area to put in more agricultural land, then the wildlife distribution change. They may go into the houses, they may go closer to humans. All of a sudden you see a disease outbreak, where previously these animals were far away from human contact. Other things like development, hydrology will also, for instance, change these things. Then another important thing, and I think this is very linked to animal welfare, is how healthy is the animals? Because we do know that if the animals are not healthy, then there's more chances of them transmitting these pathogens, because they will shed it into the environment at a higher rate, at a higher titer, and then they can more easily spill over to humans or other animals. And this is typically linked to things like if resources become scarce, even things like toxins and pollutants. So it's really part of a really bigger picture. And then also how long the pathogens can survive. You've got environmental issues there and human behavior leading to contact. And then also human health. Human health is also important. If humans are also not healthy and there's all kinds of pre-existing conditions, nutritional stress, decreased immune function, there's also a higher susceptibility. So I think this is a nice diagram showing a few examples of how all these things are actually linked to what actually happens with spillover from this natural environment where we have this, people say it's 1.7 million that we don't even know about, that's still in this natural environment, the pathogens that we don't even know about. So there's just this huge diversity that if we're going to give them the chance to spill over into humans, it's going to happen. So the holistic approach, and there's lots of definitions, and I like quite a simple definition in this diagram that I borrowed from one of the international organizations, where we're basically saying the health of people is connected to the health of animals, and plants and our shared environment. And this overlaps at some places. And that is where, if we look at pandemic preparedness, we're very much focused on where these overlaps happen. But the picture is much bigger. Animal health is not just where it's going to cause, it's not just important where it's going to cause pandemics. There's a bigger picture. And if you start addressing the overlapping factors, you're also going to address animal health in general, human health in general, environmental issues in general. And those are much bigger spin-offs of following this holistic One Health approach. So just to give you an idea of how things have changed, or the thinking is starting to change. So previously, we would surveillance. We would go out in nature, we try and collect samples, we test them, we say, okay, here's a Ebola virus, there's a Marburg virus, there's an avian flu virus. And we try and do early detection in humans and other animals. So we try and put up these surveillance programs so that we can detect early, stop it, and then we're not going to have a lot of human infections and pandemics. Obviously, that didn't work well with COVID. And there's just so many pathogens out there that at some point we're going to miss them if this is our only approach. So the approach, and this is what we mean also with One Health, needs to be much bigger. We need to understand the host, and that is also in terms of the host ecology, how healthy the host is. We also need to make sure the animals are healthy. And then we need to understand this animal-human interface that's actually leading to spillover. And this animal-human interface that creates the contact, or the factors are made worse by things like poverty, things like population growth, things like bad infrastructure, no water, no sanitation. Loss of biodiversity is just really making these factors worse in certain parts of the world compared to others. One thing we also need to recognize in terms of prevention, and this is already a slide that's a year old, but at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, this was an estimation done by Dobson et al., where they looked at how much does it cost us to prevent pandemics. And if you look at the top, you know, we have these wildlife trade monitoring systems in place that cost us money. We have early detection. We need to monitor livestock for if diseases spill over. We spend some money on deforestation. There's also some money spent on trying to end wild meat trades. And this is just a few examples, but if they count all of this up, it's about 31 billion. If you go and look at the bottom part of this figure, and this was already a year ago, I think COVID is actually going to be, the estimations are going to be worse. The disease damages, and this is economic and life and all of that taken into account, is trillions. The other thing I also like about this estimation is the benefits of prevention we sometimes don't look at. So if we do look at deforestation, there's also some benefits in terms of pollution that we also need to recognize. And this will be true for other examples with wildlife also. There's some benefits that's also got an economic value if we look at it. So looking at a holistic approach really makes sense economically. So in 2021, May, a few months ago, the FAO OIE, World Health Organization, which has always been the tripartite, together with the United Nations Environmental Programme, established this high-level panel. And it consists of 26 individuals from all over the world, really focusing on advising these 4 organizations on how to go forward following a One Health approach. And what does that mean, really? And are we doing it right? Do we need to really change direction? Or is it really just a question of strengthening programs? So that's all the questions that's being asked in the international environment. And this is not a new initiative. A lot of you may be familiar with the tripartite. I mean, they already almost 15 years ago already started discussing working together on animal health, human health, as well as food, the Food and Agricultural Organization. But the United Nations Environmental Programme was not really part of this agreement. And COVID really showed that we need to really bring in the environment, because that's where a lot of the issues are that we need to address if we want to prevent spillover. So what's new about this panel is really that UNEP is part of the collaboration, and that the discussion is much broader than just focused on diseases of animals and humans and how to improve human health. This was initiated by the German and French government that actually asked for a panel like this in November 2020, and then it was established in 2021. So, like I said, it's really about advising the partners. An important thing is advising the partners based on research. So it's not based on opinions. So if there's no proof to give advice, those areas need to be flagged as deficient in data and need to be prioritized going forward in terms of research and getting information. A lot of it is also really looking at how we can share data. And there's a lot of international initiatives. There will be a launch of the German, the Berlin Information Hub today, which is a start for trying to get a place where we can share data. And if I talk about sharing data, if you look at One Health, this is not about where we detected avian flu, where we detected the coronavirus. It's also sharing data on factors that's important in spillover. We need to also look and flag things like the wildlife trade. We need to have that data. Sometimes we don't even have it. We need to know what's going on. Where's the risk areas? Where's the open markets? Where's live animals being sold? That type of data also need to be part of the bigger picture and not just disease surveillance data. I've got lots of, so the people involved in this panel is not just disease experts. I'm a virologist, but there's people working on social sciences. There's people on wildlife and ecosystem health. Animal welfare has been one of the topics that's been discussed in a lot of the conversations, and how that fits into this One Health picture, because it's really an important aspect. And I think Kelly will also highlight that. And then also people on climate and environmental health, economics. So it's really a wide range of expertise advising the partners. So what we've done in the last few months, and there will be opinion pieces and documents coming out at the end of the year with the first conclusions or type of advice of where we think some of these initiatives must go in the future, how it can be combined, how it can be done better, but also looking at case studies of what have worked and what didn't work in the past, and where do we really need to change our thinking going forward. So there's different working groups looking at One Health and theory of change, really making an inventory of all initiatives going on. And this is not just based on publications. This is really also looking at what funding agencies are funding, so that we really can get an idea of what is going on the ground. What is the type of work that's been done, and why is the information not shared, and how can we share that information? Because a lot of the information is sitting in research groups, and there's no way of getting that out until there's maybe a publication or a policy document or something that's going to be written. We need to share that information much quicker. Then surveillance, and this is really, we talk now about surveillance in the One Health concept. We're not talking about just detecting pathogens. We're really talking about looking at the other factors that's involved in spillover as part of the surveillance. You need to know what is the amount, the diversity in areas of wildlife. You need to know if there's open markets or wet markets, as it's been called. You need to know all the things. Where's their wildlife farming? You know, where are there issues with the welfare? What do we need to address? Because it's a difficult thing just to ban everything. So we're probably going to have to look at better ways, reducing what we can, but looking at better ways of monitoring and regulating high-risk interfaces going forward. So I always show this slide because we've got so many documents. I mean, we've got documents on trade in endangered species, on biodiversity, global health, the tripartite One Health plans that was written. And a lot of it is, unfortunately, if we go down to the ground, is talk in documents. And there's not a lot of practical implementation and really good practice stories where we can say this was implemented, it worked very well. People are really working together under this One Health umbrella where all the stakeholders are included. We're looking at all the factors. Sometimes we exclude a lot of the factors that's actually important. And even it sounds daunting, how are we going to do that? But even if we can just get everybody around the table at the beginning to talk together and plan activities together, and then prioritize what can be done when, depending on resources, that will already be a huge step forward. So I'm going to stop there. That was the end of my talk. Let me just stop share. I don't know if you want to take questions now, Melanie, or
what we'll do is we'll take Dr. Marnovic's ones as well, and then we'll do questions and answers at the end, if that's okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Makote. And so our second speaker is Dr. Kelly Marnovic, who works at the Department of Nature Conservation at the Tshwane University of Technology. Her key area of interest is large carnivores and human-wildlife conflict, and she has over 20 years experience in the conservation sector. She's, amongst others, chair of the IUCN African Lion Working Group and vice president of the South African Wildlife Management Association. She's also a member of the IUCN Cat Specialists Group, and she was a member of the high-level panel appointed by Minister Creasy that just finished their report recently, as you all know. So over to you, Dr. Marnovic in the Kruger.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm just getting aware that my bandwidth is low and my internet's unstable, so I'm just going to chitty chat a little bit while that passes. And also, Kristen said she would kindly share my presentation for me just to try and save some bandwidth on this side. I think I must turn off my video if that's okay.
Yes,
just to conserve what little bandwidth we have. Yeah. Can you hear me clearly?
So far, so good. Let's hear you.
Now.
There we go.
Okay, hope it keeps going. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to be, is it okay? Thanks. Thank you for this opportunity to provide just a summary on the welfare issues around the draft policy position that came out of the high-level panel, which was, of course, focused around elephants, lions, leopards, and rhinos, but they've got a lot wider application. Next, please. Can you still hear me? Kristen, next slide, please. Thanks. So to start off with, what is welfare? The World Organization for Animal Health defines animal welfare, and South Africa is a signatory of the OIE, as the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions under which it lives and dies. Next, please. So historically, conservationists in the wildlife management sector were inclined to shy away from animal welfare. It was seen to be sort of green and bunny huggery and a little bit too touchy-feely. But in actual fact, animal welfare is science-based. And there's a large body of evidence to show that many animals are sentient, which means that they can experience pain and they can experience suffering. And as humans living with wildlife, utilizing wildlife and benefiting from these animals, it really is our responsibility to ensure that we treat them humanely and that we prevent their suffering and we ensure that the quality of life is maximized. Next, please. So we do have a lot of scientific data and expertise on all aspects and care and management of our key species from the high-level panels. That's the elephants, large carnivores, rhinos. And what we are inclined to forget is that we don't include welfare when we manage our wild animals. We don't think about the impact of our management interventions on the welfare of the animal, as well as the behavior of tourists on the welfare of animals. And our welfare is very seldom considered in our decision-making practices. And if it is considered, it's often not applied consistently to improve welfare across the board for all animals. Next, please. So in terms of the high-level panel, we had these 5 key species, if you include the 2 species of rhino. And in terms of reference, it was quite clearly stated that well-being and handling, which includes welfare, was an issue for the rhinos, for elephants, for lions, and to a lesser extent initially thought for leopards. But actually, there was some small issues around the welfare of leopards that came out in the panel discussions too. Next, please. So I thought I'd just give you a quick rundown on the types of welfare issues that we experience in wildlife. So particularly related to South Africa. So lions in captivity, we have somewhere in the region of, I don't know, anything between 9,000 and 12,000 lions in captivity. No one actually knows how many lions we have. And sadly, Environmental Affairs don't have a reliable database that we can even draw on to get those data. So we do work in a very data poor environment when it comes to captive wildlife in South Africa. But we've got these lions in captivity, generally for commercial gain, for tourism interactions, for slaughter for their bones, for bone trade to the east, as well as for what's commonly referred to as canned hunting or the shooting of captive bred lions as hunting trophies. So the types of welfare issues we see around this are poor, if any, behavioral enrichment. The lions are put into camps and they just sit around and there's nothing for them to do. We find very commonly a lack of appropriate social grouping, which is very stressful for a species that is a social species. Nutritional deficiencies are very, very common. A lot of the time, these lions are only fed meat that the landowners can source for free. So be it chickens that come off chicken trucks or local pigs from an abattoir, whatever it may be, with very little consideration for the nutritional value of the food that's been fed. The NSPCA has reported several complaints around the killing methods of these lions for their bones. And this seems to be linked to the fact that a whole skeleton has got a higher economic value than a skeleton with damaged bones on it. So when they're killing these lions, they're trying to normally shoot them in a way which doesn't damage any bones, which are generally through the soft tissues and obviously result in quite a lot of suffering for these animals. And then in the actual practice of hunting in inverted commas, I don't believe it is hunting, it's shooting of animals for their trophies. There's a lot of footage going around of these animals not necessarily being shot once and killing them swiftly without suffering. There's footage, I've seen footage of these animals being shot 5, 6, 7 times in order to kill them, which obviously has huge welfare issues attached to it. In terms of rhinos, also linked strongly to captivity, mostly. We have rhino orphanages in South Africa, and these orphanages exist as a result of the rhino poaching crisis that we're facing. So this is when a female rhino with a dependent calf has been poached. Normally the calf is just left alone because they're harmless and people are in a hurry to take the horn and get away from the scene. So when conservation officials find these carcasses, there's often a very young calf that is standing around next to the carcass. And what do we do with that calf? So orphanages have been formed for these calves. Some of them are very well managed by very well managed staff, but on the whole, they're not well managed. The staff aren't qualified for the job. These orphans are emotionally very traumatized after a poaching incident, and they're very difficult to handle by the keepers. And a lot of these orphanages use paying volunteers as their staff members. So they're often foreign, and they'll come into the facility and they'll pay to work there, and they then do the caregiving of these young rhinos. These rhinos then bond to those caregivers, and who are also inexperienced caregivers, but then the caregivers move on and new ones come in, which is further traumatizing for these young rhinos. And there's been lots of reports of disease issues and dietary issues in these orphanages, chronic diarrhea outbreaks, and those types of things. Next, please. In terms of elephants, sanctuaries are a big concern where elephants are kept in captivity. Elephant-backed safaris are of concern. A lot of the methods used to train elephants that humans can interact with them are compulsive methods and are often very cruel. And these are a big concern for the welfare of those species. And in terms of managing our elephants, particularly in our smaller fenced reserves, where we have to heavily manage these animals because they are confined, there are contraceptive programs that are in place, and very few of these consider the social aspect of elephants' lives and the impact that it can have on their welfare if they're not breeding like they're supposed to. and then culling programs for elephants too, and the welfare issues linked to those. For leopards, initially we thought there were very few welfare issues linked to them, and that's mostly because we don't have a large captive population of leopards in South Africa. But there certainly are issues. One of those is around leopard research, believe it or not. And actually one of the largest threats to leopards in South Africa is actually unregulated collaring for uncoordinated research purposes, where someone does a research project in inverted commas, they put a collar on the leopard runs off, it never gets seen again and lives the rest of its life wearing that tracking device that's not producing any reliable information, that's not contributing to our larger pool of knowledge on the species. There's some concerns around the welfare of leopards that are trophy hunted, in terms of how they're hunted and in terms of using dogs as part of the trophy hunting methodologies. And then, of course, damage-causing animals. Leopards in South Africa are one of the most conflict-causing species because they occur very widespread, they occur outside protected areas, and they're living alongside people who are using that same land for economic benefit, be it through cattle or sheep or goats or game. So often these leopards are killed as damage-causing animals, and the methods that are used to kill them are very difficult to regulate. So we're seeing leopards that have been poisoned, and dying from poisoning is a horrible, painful death, which not only impacts on the leopard, but also on the ecosystem as a whole. We're seeing leopards caught in gin traps and snares, which damage them and leave them in pain. So lots of issues around damage-causing animals. And then for cultural use, there's a real problem in that many of the tribal authorities aren't able to gain legal access to leopard skins for their cultural practices. And as a result, they have to resort to illegal methods of obtaining these skins, which often means that capturing these leopards doesn't take their welfare into consideration, and that's just from pure necessity. There's no other way of getting hold of the products that they require for their cultural practices. And something that's really cross-cutting across all the species and even into other species in South Africa is vets and the conflict of interests. So vets are often seen as welfare experts, especially by our courts. And it's not always true. They're veterinary scientists. They're not welfare experts. And when vets are asked to testify in court, this can be very, very problematic. Often vets are asked to testify against other vets, which I think the conflict of interest there is very obvious. Also, vets have got paying clients who own wildlife, and to report your paying clients for a contravention can be very difficult. And there's also instances where vets don't act in the best interest of the animal because they're under some sort of pressure. So an example may be there needs to be some kind of capture of animals happening, which requires darting and moving of the animals. You've got trucks, you've got permits, everything is in place. The client is paying for it, and the vet's under a lot of pressure to dart those animals regardless of the circumstances, be it too hot or they've been chased for a long time. And as a result, the animal's welfare is sometimes neglected. Next, please. So a very quick glance at the legal framework. I'm not going to go into any detail about this, but animal welfare is linked to our constitution and it is embedded in our legislation. However, animal rights are not. So rights are very different to welfare, and I think the two are often confused, which is problematic. So in the 2016 court case, it was the SPCA versus the Minister of Justice and others. The Constitutional Court concluded that the rationale behind protecting animal welfare has shifted from merely safeguarding the moral status of humans to placing an intrinsic value on animals as individuals. And guarding the interest of animals reflects their reflects constitutional values. So this sort of area of animal rights, animal welfare, and the constitutionality of it really is a field that there's a lot of discussion happening on and is changing all the time. But I think what's important to realize currently is that for any person in South Africa to own a wild animal, all you need is a permit, and that permit doesn't require any qualification for you to own that animal. In welfare, in husbandry, in diet, in anything, all you need is an appropriate camp, which is very, very problematic and certainly doesn't promote the welfare of the animals that are under the control of those unqualified people. Next, please. So, but one of the big issues we do have under our legal framework is that the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment is the body that's responsible for issuing of permits for restricted activities with wildlife. So that's under NEMBA and TOPS. So that would be things like keeping in captivity, possessing, transporting. But environment, the Department of Environment has got no welfare mandates. That welfare mandate forms under falls under the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. But when environment issues their permits, they don't consult with agriculture, but agriculture is supposed to police the welfare of the animals under which permits have been given by environment. So it's ended up in a huge policy gap, and which has resulted in neither parties being taken responsibility for animal welfare in South Africa. And as a result, hundreds of animals have suffered while this policy gap has just existed. Next, please. And the NSPCA, the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, is legally mandated with the responsibility of animal welfare in South Africa under the SPCA Act from 1993. But it's a really flawed system because, first of all, the NSPCA don't have access to government records, so they don't know where these animals are. They don't know how many of them are. They've got no say in the issuing of permits for these animals. The NSPCA is terribly under-resourced, and they work really, really hard, but they're reliant on donor funding, which is very problematic. Next, please. So how do we evaluate welfare? So there's 3 welfare models I'm going to touch on very briefly. And the first one is the 5 freedoms. And these 5 freedoms require an animal to have freedom from thirst, hunger, and malnutrition, freedom from thermal and physical discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from fear and distress, and freedom to express normal behavior. Next, please. And this all makes sense in an environment where your animals are captive. And this is the 5 freedoms is a model that is currently used by the NSPCA. It's recognized by a judicial system, and it works really great for captive animals, but it doesn't work that great here in the Kruger National Park. So if it gets really, really cold, how do we ensure the animals in the Kruger Park are free from thermal distress? We can't do that, and it's not in the best interest of conservation to do that either. Next, please. So there's a slightly more workable and relevant model is the 5 domains. And the 5 domains recognize that animal welfare is subjective. It's more science-based and then the 5 freedoms. And it's much more objective, which allows you to apply it to a wider variety of circumstances and activities, which is much more appropriate for wildlife when they're managed right across a managed to wild continuum from very, very captive where they rely on people for everything to totally wild like they would be here in Kruger. And this model just includes a couple of functional domains. So there's the nutritional domain, the environmental domain, the health domain, behavioral domain, and then the overall mental state and well-being. Next, please. So while that works a lot better, there actually is a much more comprehensive model, which is the model that the high-level panel has suggested and has been pulled forward into this policy that has recently been published. And this is One Welfare. And One Welfare is a growing global model. It's a non-Western centric approach to animal welfare, which is really much more appropriate. And it highlights the interconnectivity between animal welfare, human well-being, and the environment, and is very strongly linked to One Health. It's interdisciplinary, and it includes improving human and wildlife welfare internationally. It supports food security, sustainability, reducing human suffering, and improving productivity within the farming sector. And Prof. Wanda now spoke about COVID-19 as a good example, where there certainly are a lot of animal welfare issues linked to those wet markets in Wuhan. Next slide, please. So One Welfare is an extension of One Health, and it very much recognizes that welfare depends on and influences human welfare and environmental sustainability. And it requires a lot of cooperation between vets and related animal services like trainers and animals owners, environmental scientists and human psychiatrists, who all need to collaborate and share expertise in order to ensure that the welfare of both animals and the owners is maximized. Next, please. So One Welfare really is a big umbrella. And under that umbrella the umbrella is animal welfare, human well-being, and environmental conservation. And underneath that is everything linked to it. So it's poverty and local community support, it's animal-human abuse, it's socioeconomic issues, sustainability, and everything linked to that. Next, please. So why is welfare so important? I mean, are we just really talking about, being nice to animals? Well, actually, it's so much more than that. There are clear links between animal cruelty, violence, and criminality. And animal abuse is a clear predictor for other violent crimes, domestic abuse, and neglect. And there's a huge body of research to show that cruelty to animals indicates personality flaws, mental disturbances, and there's a high probability that the abuse of animals will commit a range of other serious offenses. And that abuse of animals is linked to abuse of children and people's partners, which is also known as a toxic triad. And this is increasingly important in South Africa, where we've got these very, very high levels of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So I'm wrapping, thanks. So essentially domestic violence, here's some examples of how it would work. In domestic violence situations, if a family pet is victim of violence, it's likely that other members of the family are victims of violence. So vets should be trained to cross-report any animals that are seen as victims of violence to social services to help them maybe go and investigate those areas and make sure that people in those areas aren't being victims of violence. Next, please. Another clear example is animal hoarding. It's a recognized mental illness where people take in more animals than they can care for. And the hoarder doesn't realize the severity of the situation. And it's dirty, there's fishies, there's hair, there's dead animals, and it's unsanitary for both the people living in those environments as well as the hoarder. So often animal welfare services are the first to rescue these animals, and they should be cross-referencing that and reporting that back to human health services. Next, please. And then management of wild populations of animals. So for example, damage-causing animals like leopards, there's often no real justification required to get destroy permits and no criteria to kill them. So often poisoning, bad shooting, traps are used in which the welfare of the animal is not seen to. When there are non-lethal methods that can be used that improve your farming productivity, improve your food security, and don't hamper the welfare of the wildlife. Next, please. So how do we make one welfare work? Well, essentially, it's a massive cross-disciplinary approach of reporting. So we're talking about veterinary and shelter staff, child protection and social services, psychiatrists, government departments, and it requires formal cross-reporting avenues with representatives from all these parties who are well-trained in all of these fields. Next, please. So in conclusion, South Africa has got a massive human and welfare crisis on our hands, and our current models of animal welfare are difficult to apply across our management spectrum, and we've got huge gaps in our mandate that result in the welfare of people and animals being neglected. And the One Welfare, which is an extension of One Health approach, is a really good way of addressing this for the benefit not only of animals, but for people in society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry to have rushed you. I just want to give MPs enough time to ask questions. So over to the MPs now, if you can indicate to me either by putting your hand up, on Zoom, or else if you want to put your microphone on and or camera on and just wave at me, I'll try and see you. Honorable Paulson, fire away.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you very much for an excellent and informative presentation. My first question is, how is the operations of One Health funded? And other than this wonderful research being in your possession, how is it disseminated to the relevant departments in government? Because I think it's very interesting the fact that people who abuse animals are certainly people who are most likely to abuse other people as well, and it's a clear indication your relationship with animals are most likely similar to the relationship to human beings. So how is this wonderful research and knowledge disseminated to other departments like social development departments? Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you for that. I think that is mostly to Professor Makota, right? it's a question I also asked, is what is the impact of this international, how does it engage with domestic governments then, and particularly in South Africa?
So I think Kelly can also comment on how they report. So this is one of the issues. So One Health practically on the ground is still in silos. So if you look at human, animal, and environmental health, it's between 3 different departments in South Africa, for example. If you go down to municipal level, it's maybe even worse. So to try and the funding is fragmented, and I think everybody understands as soon as that is fragmented and the human resources is fragmented, it's very difficult to get people to work together. South Africa's got a One Health National Committee, which consists of all the departments that's represented on there, and they're busy writing a national plan that can address some of these issues. But from the high-level expert committee, this is really something that the 4 partners are already engaging with governments about how can we look at really efficiently doing these things on the ground because of the way structures are already in place, in countries, and how fragmented it is. So that is a difficult, it's a constraint. And I think one of the roles of OLEP is really to relook at how we use funding on international level, and that will also filter down to governmental level for this type of work. Kelly, I don't know if you want to add, or maybe reporting. So a lot of this don't get to government departments where it's needed. I do report to Department of Health and Department of Agriculture on my research, specifically on bat pathogens, because it's flagged under the Section 20 regulations. But as soon as research is not under Section 20 Animal Disease Act, it doesn't get reported, or there's no need for you to report it. So I think we need to look at our structures of really getting this information to where it's needed. On a country level and then higher up internationally.
Kelly, did you want to come in there?
Yes, thank you. I was going to leave my camera off in interest of bandwidth. I think in terms of animal welfare, particularly wildlife welfare in South Africa, we are just so far behind. We've still got environmental affairs sitting on the one side saying it's not our mandate, and they've now sort of started to try and include a definition of welfare under NIMBA. And on the other side, we've got agriculture saying, well, what do we know about lions? And I think in terms of animal welfare in South Africa, we're so far behind. And I think this policy that's now been published, where we actually acknowledge that One Welfare is a really useful way to go. I think it's going to go a long way to addressing many of these issues, because if it's everyone's mandate and everyone's trained for it and everyone's reporting on it, then no one can wash their hands of that and say it's not their responsibility anymore. But certainly in terms of wildlife welfare, it's a very, very long way from being anywhere remotely sort of organized at ground level. Thanks.
Thanks. Honorable Singh.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Sorry I joined a bit late, and thank you to the 2 presenters for the very wonderful presentation that has a nexus between them. But I think perhaps my concern and question will require the professor to give us an answer. We know that, we've had COVID, we've had bats and rats and pangolins and everything else causing all these major problems, and I think you can count the cost both in life and in financial resources. Now, I heard her say that yes, there's a lot of surveillance, there's a need to recognize, but the question is, are we recognizing in good time the fact that there could be another zoonotic pandemic lurking somewhere? And are these agencies doing enough to sort of think ahead and say, well, there could be a problem here or there? Is government doing enough in terms of legal and illegal trade in wildlife, etc.? What assurances do we have as NGOs, as government that, you know, we're not going to go through another zoonotic pandemic like this. And that's the cause of concern that I have. And if there are such areas that they are, you know, that there could be concerns or pandemic, what are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? So that's perhaps my concern for now. And question, thank you.
So I think the answer is we are not prepared. I think that's why there's these new initiatives on an international level also, where large agencies are really looking at how they do things. We're not prepared for, if there's another one tomorrow, we won't know it. We're not at that point yet. I say we do surveillance. It's very sporadic. It's very opportunistic. It's done by different funding agencies. It's not shared. The information is not shared. The information is not shared in real time. I mean, China is an example of that. The first bat virus that was related to COVID-19, to SARS coronavirus 2, was on a computer on a researcher's desk. And only after COVID-19 was identified, they said, well, we found these related viruses in bats. So we have flagged it, we're not sure. Maybe we would just think it's another bat virus, but that information wasn't out there until after the outbreak. And we shouldn't be in that situation. There needs to, we only report on notifiable diseases. So even in South Africa, we've got a list on notifiable diseases. So that's when an animal gets sick, you know, there's foot and mouth, we report. We're not reporting on the diversity that we're detecting in wildlife or in other animals. We're only looking at disease. And these zoonotic diseases don't cause disease in the animals. It's when they spill over to humans. So I think we really need to look at our reporting systems and what we're reporting and what we're doing with that data and how we can then try and predict. That will already be a massive step forward, just sharing data. And then we need to look at what we need to monitor. And I'm a virologist, but my personal feeling is we need to focus more on these factors that's causing spillover. And that's much broader than just pandemics. It's social, it's economic issues, it's the same issues that's going to also cause pandemics that we really need to look at.
Just to follow up, Melanie.
I was going to ask you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think we can't just lift our hands up in the air and say, well, there's nothing we can do. Although the professor is trying to, you know, offer some advice. What do we need to do? Who needs to do it? And by when do we need to do it? And how do we need to bring this to the fore? That, I mean, these kinds of diseases and pandemics has cost us billions, in fact. The whole world is reeling 2 years after we've discovered this, you know, the COVID virus or pandemic or whatever we want to call it. So who needs to do what? And what role can Parliament of South Africa and this portfolio committee play to ensure that we bring relevant role players around the table and say, guys, please take this seriously. Otherwise, it just becomes a run-of-the-mill thing that we don't care about. It is serious. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe practically as a start, you know, on the ground, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and Department of Environmental Affairs, and they've now got longer names, needs to work together. And it shouldn't just be a committee on One Health. There needs to be ways for them to work together. We're not even getting it right for rabies. We're battling with that. You know, we can't share budgets. We can't share human resources. There's just too many restrictions still in place and complications. And if we can even just get that done, and we can look at reporting between those departments already, that's efficient and that's not just focused on notifiable or communicable diseases, then we're already going to get far. And then we need to be able to look at things like social issues and all the other things. But if you can just start with what the basic core of One Health is, animal, human, and environmental health, it will already make a big difference.
Seems to me there's the possibility of a joint meeting here between those three portfolio committees might already be interesting, you know, to have this discussion again in a joint meeting. I don't know if that's possible with the schedules, but yeah, it seems like that's quite important. Kelly, do you want to add something?
Yes, please. I'd just like to support what Prof. Wanda is saying, in that, you know, since TOPS and NIMBA were written, you know, we've had environmental affairs sitting on their hands saying, well, welfare is not their mandate. And we've had agriculture going, well, what do we know about lion welfare? We can't get those two departments into one room. We can't get them to share databases. We don't even know how many lions we have in cages in South Africa. You can't contact environmental affairs now and say to them, could you please tell me how many lions we have in which facility? They can't tell you that. So a lot of the management we're trying to do is in a very data poor environment. And it's very unfortunate. And if we think that, you know, if we look at sort of the sectors of our country that got the ability to grow and to, you know, for economic growth, the environment is one of those. And, you know, we think what infrastructure is put in place for mining. I mean, I'm sure they know a lot more about mining than we know anything about our environment and our conservation sector. So I think, you know, for me, I would like to see wildlife conservation taken a lot more seriously by our government and a lot more resources thrown at it. And we need to change how we do things. You know, it's great to do monitoring and to see, oh, you know, where the next pandemic may come from. But why don't we rather change how we manage our wildlife to prevent the, you know, to prevent a pandemic like that in the first place? We've got, you know, we've seen COVID-19 in captive lions. We've seen it in captive mink farms in Europe. Captive wildlife is highly problematic, and yet we're one of the few countries in the world that keeps putting stuff in cages and captive breeding them. So, you know, I think there's a lot we could do right now that could be very beneficial. And then there's a lot that's a lot bigger, like we've spoken about One Health and One Wealth, which is a lot bigger and a lot more collaborative. But certainly a lot we could do now just by getting two departments to talk to each other and implement those recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock. I just want to see if there is anybody else who would like to ask a question. You can just push your camera on if you want to and indicate to me. Honorable Mbata, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Melanie. How are you?
I hope your flu is getting better.
I'm trying my best. Yesterday we had a meeting from 6 until 1:30 a.m. But at least I'm getting better. You know, I'm very much worried because firstly, trophy hunting, it's illegal. But I know there was one, a company that exposed one of the senior leaders who was involved in trophy hunting. And it gives me a problem because if there are senior leaders who are involved in trophy hunting, it will be difficult for us to assist those animals, because if you look at how they are treated, it's not okay. Remember, there was also, when I look at trophy hunting, I also look at the lion breeding, where it's totally not correct for the wild animals to be changed to a domestic animal, and how they are being killed. And there's a lot of money that is being done. But my worry is that within the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forest and Fisheries, there are committees that are multi-sectoral. There are multi-sectoral that deals with all these issues. I was wondering if the Department of Environmental Affairs should start that one, because I know they usually lead those things. Because if you look at this one, it should be the Environmental Affairs, it should be Department of Health, it should be Agriculture, and I think including police, in order to deal with this situation, and the local government. I don't know what's that, SALGA, because in those areas we have municipalities that must also be involved. And it's a concern to me that at least we make noise in the department, in our portfolio committee, until the minister did something on the high level panel. But although we haven't had the presentation back on us on how far they did that panel investigate, so that we know what is happening. Because I believe that as a portfolio committee on environment, this must be our priority. And also, we must also get the presentation to the portfolio committee from these the NGOs or the private sector that are dealing with these issues. Because I remember at one stage, we had not once, more than once, where they came and they presented, and they are an NGO that is fighting for lion breeding to be stopped in South Africa. I think there we managed to do something as the portfolio committee. But I just wanted to ask the presenters here, have they tried to look at have a multidisciplinary sector where all departments, different departments that features in this thing, and also the municipalities, SALGA, and them coming together and paving a better way to say how best can they save these animals. And my worry is that last time they said with the tradition, because I'm Zulu by birth, and I know one of our cultures, because on Dabezita, they are from the royal family. So the leopard is one of the skin that we use, which it's a sign of being in a royal family. And I think these are the things that we should look at. And the big fives mostly, they are being used by, it's those animals that are being symbolic to the traditional health practitioners. So those are the things that also when they sit down and discuss these issues, they must also involve the traditional health practitioners. I know at the Department of National Health, there is an office that deals, a department that deals with traditional health practices, including medicine. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. I know there were a number of issues raised there. Some were more comments than others. So I'm thinking, well, I'll go ahead, Professor, and then Kelly, you can go after that.
So I'll give a broad answer. So we, for instance, have like I said, the National One Health Committee. We worked on a National One Health plan before COVID, and then nothing happened since then. So this is now 2.5 years later, because we need those plans on the table to drive things in the departments, where people have signed off on it in the different departments. But there's this delay in getting things done, and it's actually urgent. I mean, we need to be prepared for pandemics. And we had a discussion yesterday at GIPS, we need our healthcare services to be better. We need vaccines, but we also need to think about prevention. We can't just do that. That's one part of the picture. We can't afford a pandemic every second year, even if we have good hospitals, even if we have vaccines. We still need to look at prevention also. And that urgency is, for me, not there. And just first getting those structures to write those plans, get it approved quickly, and then do the add-ons. You know, if welfare needs to come in and other aspects need to come in, we add it onto something that's already existing and people that's already around one table with one goal. Then it becomes easier. But we have a lot of delays in the urgency of doing some of these things. And I'm also on that committee. So I'm also the one that can tell them, listen, it must happen, but it must maybe also come from a higher level.
Kelly? Kelly, are you still there, or did you fall off? Ah, she fell off. That's the Kruger now. Honorable Khantu, I know your hand was up as well.
Yes, Melanie, good day, colleagues. I only had one question with regards to this issue of SPCA that does not have records. I just want to ask whose responsibility it is to have to collect the data of these animals, and also the record keeping. Whose responsibility is it to collect this data? Remember, we have also animals that are in captivity that even us as government does not have control of. So I just wanted to ask that clarity. Thank you.
So I think I can also comment on that.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's sometimes a bit blurry who's responsible. So I, for instance, asked for livestock data a while ago. We don't even have our livestock updated.
You mean like agriculture?
Yes, so that's agriculture. But then at some point, so the wildlife, I think, falls under environmental affairs, but we really don't have an idea of where our wildlife and everything is and the amounts. So there's some data from 5-6 years back. Some of it is not publicly available, but it's completely outdated. And it's not just for wildlife. Now, if you think about pandemics and preparedness for outbreaks, you need to at least know, where you have big farms, where you have this interaction between wildlife and other animals, where you have captive animals, wildlife, where are people maybe starting with wildlife farming, which is now a huge issue internationally. And we don't have that data. And I think environmental affairs and agriculture needs to sit and decide who's doing what in terms of that.
So am I correct that my understanding is part of the problem here is that the ball falls between the crack between environmental affairs and agriculture? That's what's being said all the time, that on the one hand, agriculture is supposed to do a lot of this, but they don't have the knowledge base about the wild side, and environmental affairs says it's not within their legislative brief. Am I correct? Am I summarizing it correctly?
Yeah, I think agriculture, specifically the veterinary services part, focus on disease. So conservation falls to environmental affairs side, and some of these aspects are across the board, and then it's not done. So I think getting data is one of our biggest issues, and having accurate data.
Does that help, Honorable Khanso?
Yes, Melanie. Yes, okay. I'm covered. Yes, thank you.
If nobody has a burning question, let me just make 100% sure nobody's putting their hands up. I just, because I am conscious again that you need to have some lunch before you get into your linking up with Parliament again. Can I just say thank you very, very much to Professor Makota, and also to Dr. Marnovic. She's fallen off because she's in the Kruger and she's trying to reconnect, but I'm not going to. I will thank her in her absence so long. Thank you. I'm guessing that there'll be follow-ups to this, because I think it is such crucial, these things that we're discussing now, given what's been happening to us in the last year, and what is it now, almost a half. So thank you very, very much for your time. And Professor Makota, we wish you well in the international panel. It's always good to know that there are South Africans making themselves heard there. And yeah, I'm sure we will be in touch again, and with some follow-up questions and so on from the MPs. So thank you very much for that.